All right, so today we are diving into a platform I think we've all been hearing a lot about lately, Rumble. And I think, there's been a lot of buzz, but we really wanted to get into what is really going on with Rumble. What is this platform all about? And luckily, we've got some really, really interesting research that we can dive into today
That's some good stuff.
to really kind of unpack, what is the political landscape of Rumble? Who is actually using it? And how does it compare to the big kahuna of online video, which is, of course, YouTube?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating comparison, especially these days.
Yeah, totally. So to help us unpack all of this, we've got a really interesting academic paper that we're going to be looking at today called, and get ready for this title, Podcast Outcasts, Understanding Rumble's Podcast Dynamics. I know, right? But it's really interesting stuff, I promise. And we're also going to be looking at some of the latest data from Pew Research Center, specifically about how people are getting their news these days. And then we also have this really thought-provoking article from Dazed that asks the question, what is Rumble, the shadowy right-wing social media platform?
Well, someone's doing the research. I like it.
Always. You know me. So I have to say, that word shadowy that Days uses in that article title really jumped out at me. What makes Rumble so shadowy, and should we be concerned?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, it's definitely a loaded term,
Right.
but I think it speaks to the sense that Rumble has become kind of a haven for voices that are feeling like they're being pushed out of the mainstream. And, it's not a coincidence that Rumble's popularity really exploded during the pandemic and then again after the 2020 election.
Oh, interesting.
Right, like this time when distrust in traditional media was also kind of on the rise.
Yeah, it's like a perfect storm of events kind of created this opening for a platform like Rumble.
Exactly. And Rumber's founder, Chris Pavlovsky, he actually leans into that, calling the platform, and I quote, neutral, but also immune to cancel culture. And I think those are really loaded terms, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And they definitely resonate with a certain audience. But even with all of that, all of those buzzwords, the Pew Research data actually shows that only 2% of U.S. adults are actually getting their news from Rumble. That's not a huge number.
It's not a huge number, no, but here's where it gets kind of interesting. Of that small percentage, a whopping 83% are either Republican or lean Republican.
Wow. Really?
So we're talking about a really niche audience for sure,
Yeah.
but one with a very, how should we say, a very specific set of views.
For sure. And who are some of these big names that are drawing in this audience? Because Days calls out a pretty specific lineup in that article. They mentioned Donald Trump, Andrew Tate, Russell Brand, Ben Shapiro.
Right, it's like a who's who of,
Right, people who've been banned or demonetized on other platforms.
Precisely. And that just feeds right back into Rumble's whole anti-censorship brand, right?
That's right, yeah.
But it's not just about who is on Rumble, it's about what they're actually saying on the platform.
Of course, yeah.
And that's where this academic study that I mentioned, the Podcast Outcasts paper, that's where it gets really, really interesting.
Okay.
They actually analyzed thousands of podcast videos from both Rumble and YouTube. And they used AI to do this analysis.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, to try to avoid any kind of subjective bias.
Which is smart in today's climate.
Absolutely.
So what did they find? What are people actually talking about on these Rumble podcasts compared to, say, YouTube?
Well, get ready to have your mind blown.
Yeah.
The study found that a staggering 70% of popular Rumble podcast topics align with right-wing themes.
Wow, 70%.
70%, compared to only 25% on YouTube.
Wow. Okay, so we're not just talking about a difference in degrees here. We're talking about a completely different conversation happening.
Exactly. And it's not even just these broad themes, but specific keywords. They found that words like vaccine, ballots, Ukraine, Roe v. Wade are just popping up constantly. These are hot-button political issues that are being discussed, but through a very, very specific lens, right?
Right, yeah, one that's critical of those mainstream narratives.
Exactly.
And meanwhile, over on YouTube, it's a whole different world. They're talking about sports, they're talking about cars, you name it, it's over there.
Right, much more diverse.
Yeah, it really highlights how algorithms and how content moderation on these platforms really shape our online experiences in such a profound way.
100%.
On Rumble, you're just more likely to encounter content that reinforces existing beliefs, which, it can be fine, but it can also lead to echo chambers and more polarization.
Exactly. It's a slippery slope.
So we kind of have a sense of what they're talking about on Rumble, but what I'm curious about is what is actually drawing in the viewers? What is getting the most views?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
The study found a really strong correlation between views on Rumble and discussions about cancel culture.
Interesting.
And I don't know if you can guess who the, poster child for that seems to be on Rumble.
Let me guess, is it Andrew Tate?
Ding, 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 we have a winner.
Of course.
His content is often very provocative, it pushes boundaries, and that seems to be really, really attracting a large audience on Rumble.
Yeah, so it's not even just about feeling canceled or whatever, but it's the content itself has to be provocative in order to really get those views.
It seems that way. It does.
Yeah.
And the research also highlighted some other themes that really seem to resonate on Rumble. Discussions about COVID-19, especially things like the Omicron variant and ivermectin. And then, kind of interestingly, they found a lot of criticisms of platforms like YouTube
Oh, interesting.
for, you guessed it, censorship.
Oh, the irony, right. It's
Yeah.
this feedback loop. The more you hear about being censored, the more you seek out platforms like Rumble, and on it goes.
Exactly. It's a cycle.
But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how they're actually
Yeah.
using video on this platform, because at the end of the day, this is a video platform, right? So I'm curious, did this study, did it touch upon the visuals that are being used in these podcasts at all?
They did. And it's really, really eliminating,
Oh,
actually.
yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like on Rumble, a picture really is worth 1,000 words.
Interesting.
The study found that Rumble podcasts very often use very pointed political imagery, and they often feature Democratic politicians.
Oh,
But, and this is the interesting part, they present them within the context of right-wing critiques.
so it's using these images to make a statement, but not necessarily in support of.
Exactly. Exactly.
Interesting. Were there any figures that they found were particularly?
Yeah, one that kind of stood out to me was Bill Gates.
Okay.
His image pops up quite a bit on Rumble podcasts.
And I'm going to guess it's not because they're huge fans of his philanthropy work, right?
Probably not. You're probably right about that.
Right. It's probably more tied to all those conspiracy theories that tend to swirl around him, particularly about, COVID-19 vaccines.
Yeah, exactly. And I think his appearance, or his frequent appearance, I should say, on these Rumble podcasts really points toward those beliefs being, quite prevalent within that community.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating kind of glimpse into how visuals can be just as powerful as words in terms of shaping narratives.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it, how a single image can be used to tap into a whole web of beliefs and biases. But I think this all kind of begs the question, why should we care? What's the bigger picture here?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
On the surface, you might think, okay, well, Rumble's just catering to this niche audience, so who cares?
Yeah.
But I really do think it runs much deeper than that.
You're right. Yeah.
Rumble, its rise, the kind of content that it's promoting, it reflects this much bigger shift that's happening, I think, in how we consume information.
It reflects this increasing fragmentation of information. We're kind of moving away from these traditional gatekeepers of information, like your mainstream news outlets. And we're moving more and more towards these platforms that have much looser reins on the content that they allow.
Yeah, and so instead of getting hopefully a balanced viewpoint from, quote-unquote trusted sources, people are just ending up in these echo chambers where they only hear what they already believe.
Precisely.
Which is kind of scary.
It is scary, and it can have real-world consequences, right?
Totally.
Because it's not just about, people arguing about politics online anymore. It's about this erosion of trust that we see in shared institutions. And, of course, the spread of misinformation, which can impact everything from, public health to our elections. Absolutely. It's like we're almost living in these different realities.
Yeah, in a way we are, and that's incredibly dangerous. Because it becomes so much harder to have productive conversations and, find common ground, let alone find solutions to these really complex issues that our world is facing.
Totally. So where do we go from here? Is there any way to kind of bridge this divide? Or are we just headed towards this even more fragmented information ecosystem?
Those are the big questions. And I don't think there are any easy answers. But I think a crucial first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need to be having more open and honest conversations about these trends, about the power of algorithms, about the importance of media literacy.
Yeah, for sure. People need to be much more critical of what they see and hear online.
Exactly.
Don't just accept something because it happens to pop up on your feed one day.
All right, because we all have biases, and these platforms are often designed to exploit them.
That's true.
So it's about, recognizing those biases in ourselves, questioning our own assumptions, and trying to be more open to diverse perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. We need to be much more savvy consumers of the information that's out there because so much of what we see online is really just designed to keep us engaged, to keep us scrolling, even if that means appealing to our emotions rather than, our sense of reason.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head. And that's why platforms like Rumble are so fascinating because they give us this, glimpse into how quickly things can shift. Only a small percentage of people might be getting their news from Rumble right now, but that number could grow, especially if that distrust in our traditional institutions continues to decline.
And even if it doesn't grow, think about the influence these platforms can have, even with a relatively small audience. Like they can become incubators for ideas that eventually do bleed into the mainstream.
Precisely. What happens on a platform like Rumble doesn't necessarily stay on a platform like Rumble.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that, the digital world and the real world are deeply intertwined.
Totally. Yeah. It's like this whole digital ecosystem. We need to be aware of all the interconnected parts to really understand the health of the whole thing. But this has been quite the deep dive. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here today.
We've just scratched the surface,
I
really.
know, right?
But hopefully this has sparked some important questions and some conversations for our listeners today.
Absolutely. It's all about, continuing to learn, to question, to engage with this information landscape in a mindful way. But before we wrap up completely, I actually have one final thought that I want to leave our listeners with, something to kind of chew on after we finish today's deep dive.
Ooh, I like it. I'm intrigued.
We've spent all this time talking about Rumble as it exists now, right? A platform with, this largely right-leaning audience and content. But here's what I'm wondering. Could platforms like Rumble, despite their relatively small size right now, could they have an even bigger impact on politics in the future, especially as that distrust in traditional media continues to grow?
That is the question, isn't it?
Right, because it's not even just about this one platform anymore. It's about how we, as a society, how we choose to consume and share information.
It's about media literacy. It's about critical thinking.
It's about having open and respectful dialogues, even with those that we might disagree with.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we are all a part of this evolving digital world.
Mm,
And we have a responsibility to try to shape it in a positive direction.
beautifully said. And that, my friends, is a wrap on part one of our deep dive into the world of Rumble. Join us for part two, where we'll be exploring the fascinating world of Rumble's podcasters and what their content reveals about this platform's growing influence. Until then, stay curious.
It's really interesting to think about how those visuals, especially of big names and public figures, how they're being used on Rumble, like almost like a weapon in some cases.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
It is powerful stuff, but it really does make you wonder, why should we care? What's the bigger picture here? We've been talking about Rumble, but what does it all mean? Well, and that's the thing, right? Someone out there listening might be like, well, so what? Rumble, who cares? It's just this little platform.
Right.
But I think it actually runs a lot deeper than that.
Okay. I like where you're going with this.
Yeah, Rumble's rise and the kind of content that they're allowing, I think it reflects this much bigger shift that we're seeing and that we've been talking about in how we consume information these days.
Yeah.
We're moving away from those traditional gatekeepers of information, like your mainstream news outlets.
Right.
And we're moving more and more toward these platforms like Rumble that have much looser reins on the type of content that they allow.
And so it's like instead of getting, hopefully a balanced viewpoint from, we hope, trusted sources, people are just ending up in these echo chambers where all they hear is what they already believe.
Exactly. And I think that can be really dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it's not just about, arguing about politics online.
Yeah.
This is about, we're seeing this erosion of trust in our shared institutions and, of course, the spread of misinformation.
Right, which has a real impact.
A very real impact. It can impact everything from, public health to our elections.
Absolutely. It's like we're almost living in these different realities.
Yeah, in a way, we kind of are.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly dangerous because it becomes that much harder to have, productive conversations and find common ground, let alone find solutions to these really complex problems that our world is facing right now.
Totally. So where do we even go from here? Is there any way to bridge this divide that seems to be growing wider every day? Or are we just headed toward this, even more fragmented information ecosystem?
Man, those are the million-dollar questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I do think that a crucial first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need to be having more open and honest conversations about these trends, about the power that these algorithms have, about the importance of media literacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, people need to be much more critical of what they see and hear online.
Yes, 100%.
Don't just accept something as truth because it happens to show up in your feed one day.
Right, and I think it's difficult because, we all have our own biases.
Totally.
And these platforms are often designed to exploit those biases.
Right.
So it's about, first of all, recognizing that we have those biases
Yeah.
and questioning our own assumptions.
Mm.
And then trying to be more open to diverse perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that, being open to diverse perspectives. It's not about shutting down conversation. It's about, being willing to hear different opinions and different viewpoints.
Yeah.
I think we need to be much more savvy consumers of information than we are, because I think we've gotten a little bit complacent.
A little bit, and I get it. I mean,
Yeah.
we are absolutely bombarded with information these days. They're
Constantly.
coming at us from every angle. It can be really overwhelming to try to sift through it all.
Yeah, and it's hard because so much of what we see online is really just designed to keep us engaged, to keep us scrolling,
Yeah.
even if that means appealing to, our emotions rather than our sense of reason.
100%. You hit the nail on the head. And I think that's why platforms like Rumble are so fascinating, because they give us this really interesting glimpse into how quickly things can shift. Because right now, only a small percentage of people might be getting their news from a place like Rumble.
Yeah.
But that number could grow,
Mm-hmm.
especially if that distrust in our traditional institutions continues to decline.
Yeah, and even if that number doesn't grow significantly, I still think it's important to think about the influence these platforms can have, even with a relatively small audience.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, they can really become incubators for ideas that eventually do bleed out into the mainstream.
Precisely. What happens on a platform like Rumble doesn't necessarily stay on a platform like Rumble.
Exactly, exactly. It reminds me of that old adage, like, what happens in Vegas?
Right, exactly.
It doesn't stay in Vegas. It doesn't stay on Rumble.
What happens online often bleeds into the real world.
Yes, 100%. And it's a reminder that the digital world and, the quote-unquote real world are really just, deeply intertwined these days. They're not separate.
They're definitely not separate.
No, not at all. It's all one big...
That's all one big soup.
It's a soup. That's a great way to put it. It's like a big information soup. And we need to be aware of all of the different ingredients in that soup to really understand how it's all going to taste in the end.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much ground here today, but in a good way.
We've only just scratched the surface, really.
I know.
But hopefully this has sparked some really important questions for our listeners and maybe even some conversations offline.
Absolutely. It's all about continuing to learn, to question, to really engage with this information landscape in a mindful and in a critical way. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I actually have one final thought that I want to leave with our listeners, something to kind of chew on as we head into the next part of our conversation.
Ooh, I like it. Lay it on me.
Okay, so we've spent all this time talking about Rumble as it exists now, right? As a platform with this largely right-leaning audience and content.
Right.
But here's what I'm wondering. Could platforms like Rumble, despite their relatively, small size right now, could they have an even bigger impact on our politics in the future? Especially as that distrust in traditional media continues to grow.
No, that is the question, isn't it?
Right, because it's not even just about this one platform anymore.
It's so much bigger than that.
Right. It's about how we as a society choose to consume and share information. It's about media literacy. It's about critical thinking. It's about having these open and respectful dialogues, even with those that we might completely disagree with.
It's about recognizing that we are all part of this evolving digital world.
Yes.
And we all have a responsibility to try to shape it in a positive and productive direction.
Beautifully said. And that, my friends, is a wrap on part 2 of our deep dive into the world of Rumble. Join us for part 3, where we'll continue this conversation and explore some potential solutions to this growing information crisis. Until then, stay curious.
It's kind of like we're at a crossroads, like the choices we make now, both individually and as a society, are really going to determine what this information landscape looks like in the years to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the tough part is those choices aren't always easy. Right. We are constantly bombarded with information from every direction.
Oh, tell me about it.
And it can be so tempting to just throw your hands up.
Mm.
And retreat into your own little echo chamber, to
Yeah.
just surround yourself with those voices that confirm what you already believe.
Yeah, especially when those voices are, like, packaged in such an engaging and accessible way.
Exactly.
Like, it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, these platforms are businesses, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're driven by algorithms that are literally designed to keep us hooked, to keep us scrolling, to keep us clicking.
100%. And I think that's something that's really important for people to keep in mind. Because it's easy to get, swept up in the content, but we have to remember there are forces at play behind the scenes, right?
For sure, yeah. It's not just about, presenting information anymore. It's about capturing and holding our attention for as long as possible.
Totally. It's like our attention is the most valuable commodity there is these days.
Pretty much.
And Rumble's success, I think, really speaks to their ability to tap into a very specific audience and to just give them exactly what they're looking for,
Oh, yeah.
which in many cases seems to be validation, a sense of community, even if that community is built on, shared grievances and distrust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there.
It's a little bit unnerving when you really think about it.
It is. It is a little bit unnerving. And that's why I think it's so crucial that we're having these types of conversations,
Mhm.
that we're talking about these platforms, that we're dissecting their strategies, and that we're really trying to understand the impact they have on our society as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. It's about empowering ourselves to be more discerning consumers of information, I think. To
Yes.
recognize those biases that we all have, and then also the biases that are like embedded within these platforms themselves. And then to be brave enough to seek out those diverse perspectives.
Beautifully said.
I think that's really what it comes down to.
It's about understanding that the digital world isn't separate from, the quote-unquote real world.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
What we do online has real-world consequences. It shapes our perceptions. It shapes our relationships. It even shapes our democracy.
I couldn't agree more. Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today.
It's my pleasure.
But that's what we do here on The Deep Dive, right?
That's right. We're diving deep, baby.
Always diving deep. We try to leave no stone unturned.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for this, I think, really important exploration of Rumble and its place in our ever-evolving digital world.
It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Likewise. And for everyone listening out there, as always, stay curious.